Welcome back to part 2 of our mini lecture on the Battle of Verdun. In the first part, we got an understanding of where Verdun is and some of the physical location reasons and cultural reasons why the German commander Falkenhayn decided that Verdun was going to be the place for his offensive against the French. On the notes of our Battle of Verdun, I'm moving down now towards the bottom of the first page at the heading of Bleeding the French. So we want to understand now, once he's picked Verdun as his place of attack, what is it that Falkenhayn is actually planning? Is he planning a breakthrough? Is he planning to crush the French? What is it? Well, the only thing that we've got to go on are Falkenhayn's memoirs. Now, memoirs, of course, are not written during the battle, before the battle. They are written afterwards, looking back in hindsight. And what Falkenhayn writes in his own memoirs is that he understood that the offensive move would not necessarily create a breakthrough, but rather be part of a larger war of attrition, and that the French would be required to throw every man that they have to help defend Verdun. And this is a nice little quote to use: the forces of France will bleed to death. So this is what Falkenhayn says was his goal. Now, this is certainly what does happen at Verdun, as we're going to find out. But was this actually his intention at the beginning of the battle? We can't be sure. We don't know. We don't have any evidence. All we have is this evidence from his memoirs that Verdun was intended, expected to be part of a battle of attrition rather than a serious breakthrough. So the Battle of Verdun is portrayed by Falkenhayn as a calculated plan to have a moral effect on France, more so than necessarily a strategic military victory, more of a moral victory. And as we're going to find out, this is what happens with the Battle of Verdun. What happens at the Battle of Verdun is a massive use of German artillery in order to attack Verdun. And in fact, it's the most intensive artillery bombardment that we've seen in the war yet. If we take a look at the map of Verdun, and remembering that this outside line here is the line that was in place at the beginning of the battle. And along the edges of the battle, of the front line here, we see the Germans amass massive amounts of artillery. Heavy artillery, which is your really big guns with the massive shells, and also lighter artillery with smaller shells, but possibly more mobile artillery that could be moved forward if they were able to gain some ground. We've got 9 divisions of infantry, all moving to the front line at Verdun, ready to attack. In order to help move all of these troops and artillery into place, the Germans actually did lay a light rail line behind the scenes in order to help logistically move everything into the area. So this is a massive plan. This wasn't a sudden decision. This was something that Falkenhayn had planned from in 1915. A lot of work had to be done in order to prepare for this battle. The other thing that the Germans did is they dug extremely deep dugouts along this front line. And the purpose of the deep dugouts was so that when the German reserves, the massive number of troops, were moved up onto the line, they could go down into these deep dugouts, and the other side could not necessarily detect that a huge number of troops were there waiting on the line. And this adds to the surprise element of the attack. The other thing that was happening, you might remember that we started to have more reconnaissance happening with aeroplanes in 1915. Well, the Germans in the beginning of 1916 basically fight off any British planes trying to fly over this area so that reconnaissance couldn't happen. And this is where we're starting to see dogfights in the air, plane to plane, attacking each other, trying to actually secure the area and not allow the other side to gain any decent reconnaissance using airplane and the aerial photography. So we're seeing a few new tactics, strategies being put in place even before the battle begins. So the battle itself begins on the 21st of February 1916. And as planned, the Germans start with a massive artillery bombardment. And what you've got to understand is we've got artillery all the way around here, and it's all pointed in towards the same area. And so it's a very effective position for the Germans to actually use artillery bombardment just to basically bomb the crap out of this area from multiple positions. So all morning, the German guns were fired at the Allied lines, and certainly to begin with, it's around here, but as we move forward, we're coming into this more fortified area. The impact of the artillery bombardment in Verdun is well described in a number of different diary entries. We're talking about entire trees being uprooted, and we're talking about trenches, in many cases, being flattened by this heavy artillery bombardment. And when a trench collapses and there are men inside, the men die, often instantly, some from suffocation, buried within the trench. And this Verdun is very well, as I said, it's known for this, the intensity of the artillery bombardment and the destruction caused by the artillery bombardment. Here we can see some very heavy artillery. These are big guns with very large shells that are being fired during the Battle of Verdun. About midday, the Germans slackened off their barrage, and it seemed to the French, of course, that this was the end of the artillery bombardment and that the German infantry was about to attack. So the French, of course, came out of their dugouts and manned the front lines. And this is where the Germans used another tactic. Instead of starting their infantry bombardment, the Germans restarted their artillery bombardment, causing massive casualties amongst the French. So taking the French by surprise, German artillery bombardment restarts using gas and high explosive shells in order to inflict the largest number of casualties that they could, as they were catching the French unawares. And it's not until 4 p.m. on that 21st of February 1916 that the Germans actually send in their infantry attack and try to pierce through the French line. So here you can see 21st of February, they're making their first attack, and the infantry don't actually attack until 4 p.m. The following day, they restart with the artillery bombardment yet again, and then follow it up with another infantry attack with flamethrowers. This is quite effective, and the Germans are able to make a fair amount of ground. You can see on this map that by the 26th of February, 5 days later, the line has moved to this position. Okay, so they've moved certainly through all of this area, closer, much, much closer to Verdun. One of the key forts, Fort Douaumont, is actually taken in these opening few days, so taken within 4 days. And we have a very large number of French casualties in the opening days of the battle. One thing to note, however, is that while the Germans make significant gains straight away, they don't continue to push. So they establish themselves on this new line, and there's a lot of historians that criticise the Germans, that if they'd just pushed a bit harder, they would have actually been able to seize the whole of Verdun within a few days if they had continued their push with the same strength of artillery attack, followed up by a heavy infantry attack. But they don't. They take pause for a moment. And what this allows is for French reinforcements to be sent. So you can see in our notes here, I've now covered the German attack, and I'm down here to French reinforcements. And this is really a turning point in the Battle of Verdun. And one of the interesting characters that we see being sent to the front lines here is our General Philippe Pétain. Now, Pétain was a fairly well-known commander, fairly old, probably would have retired if World War I hadn't come along. But he is chosen by the commander-in-chief of the French, who is still Joffre. He picks Pétain to go to Verdun in an attempt to save Verdun. In fact, the first few days of the attack, Joffre received word, he was in Paris at the time, he received word of the attack on Verdun, and they really didn't take it that seriously to begin with. But once it became clear just the intensity of the German offensive and the fact that Verdun was actually in danger of falling, that's the point at which Pétain is selected and sent off and basically said, save Verdun at all costs. Why? It's that moral impact, the place that Verdun had in the hearts of the French. The French did not want Verdun to fall. They understood the impact that it would have on French morale overall if Verdun was to fall to the Germans. Pétain is successful in halting the German advance, and very famously, you can see in here, very famously, he is said to have issued the catch cry, and I can't speak French, but ils ne passeront pas, which means they shall not pass. Now, there is a lot of speculation as to whether it was Pétain that actually said that, but certainly this catch cry, let's defend Verdun and the Germans shall not pass, becomes part of the myth and the legend surrounding the Battle of Verdun and the French ability to hold on. One of the things that Pétain does very well is he is able to supply men, munitions, and supplies. And the way that he does this is to actually use a road. Verdun, there was really only one major road going into Verdun from the French positions. And this road, as you can see from these pictures, lines and lines of trucks, men passing up and down the line day and night, bringing reserves, ammunition, food to the French army in Verdun, keeping it well supplied in order to support its defensive efforts. And this plaque down the bottom here is actually a modern memorial in the area around Verdun. And the road became known as the Sacred Way, La Voie Sacrée. So it was so vital to the survival of Verdun that the road itself still is called the Sacred Way in remembrance of the massive effort that went into saving Verdun. The interesting thing is that Pétain did so well at Verdun that he was actually promoted, which means he was removed from Verdun and sent somewhere else on the line. And he is replaced by another general, Robert Nivelle. Joffre, remember, is still in charge of the whole French army. Nivelle is just sent to maintain the position at Verdun and make sure that the Germans don't continue. What I'm going to do is actually going to pause here because this is a turning point in the battle, and we'll come back in the next part, part 3, and find out how the Battle of Verdun proceeds and how it ends.